The monitor screamed. Victor Hale's hand trembled as it reached for the phone, lying just inches beyond his fingertips. The device, sitting on the polished mahogany desk, like it was mocking him. His chest tightened. The beeping grew sharper, faster, a mechanical panic that matched the one rising in his throat. He tried to shift his weight, tried to will his legs to move the way they used to, but nothing happened. Nothing ever happened anymore. "Somebody," he rasped, his voice barely carrying past the walls of his own study. "Somebody, please." No one came. The nurse was 40 minutes late. The housekeeper had left early for a dentist appointment. His 3 children, the ones whose photographs still lined the hallway like relics of a happier life, were miles away, living lives that no longer included him. Victor Hale, a man once worth over $4 billion, a man who had built a shipping empire from a single rusted cargo ship, was alone, dying perhaps, in a mansion with 11 bedrooms and not a single soul who cared enough to check on him. His vision blurred at the edges. The monitor's scream turned distant, muffled, like he was sinking underwater. And then small footsteps, bare feet slapping against marble. A 3-year-old boy named Mateo, curly-haired and wide-eyed, wandered into the study clutching a plastic dinosaur, his mother nowhere in sight. He froze when he saw Victor slumped in his wheelchair, pale, gasping. "Mister?" Mateo said, his voice small and uncertain. Victor tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. His eyes darted toward the red button mounted beside his desk, the emergency call button he had refused, out of stubborn pride, to ever use himself. He had told the staff 100 times he didn't need it. He wasn't an invalid, he'd insisted. He wasn't helpless. He was wrong. "Mister, you look sick," Mateo said, stepping closer, dropping his toy. Victor's eyes flicked desperately toward the button, then back to the boy, willing him with everything he had left to understand. Mateo followed his gaze. He toddled over, climbed onto the small stool beside the desk that the nurses used, and pressed his tiny palm flat against the red button. Alarms blared through the entire estate. 6 months earlier, Victor Hale had been a very different man, or at least he told himself he was. The crash had happened on a rain-slicked highway outside the city, his driver swerving to avoid a stalled truck, the car flipping twice before coming to rest against a guardrail. Victor remembered the sound most, metal screeching, glass shattering, and then silence. When he woke up in the hospital 3 days later, a doctor with tired eyes told him the damage to his spine was permanent. He would never walk again. "There has to be a surgery," Victor had said, gripping the bedsheets. "I don't care what it costs. Money is not the issue." "Mr. Hale," the doctor said gently, "some things money can't fix." Victor didn't believe him. Not then. He spent the next several weeks calling in specialists from Germany, from Japan, from anywhere that might tell him what he wanted to hear. None of them did. Slowly, the calls stopped. Slowly, the specialists stopped coming. And slowly, Victor Hale began to understand that for the first time in his 61 years, there was something in this world he could not simply purchase his way out of. His children hadn't taken it well either, though not for the reasons a father might hope. "This changes things for the company," Bradley had said during one of his rare visits, standing awkwardly at the foot of his father's hospital bed, refusing to meet his eyes. "The board is asking questions about succession." "I'm still alive, Bradley," Victor had snapped. "I'm sitting right here." "I know, Dad, I just mean we should be prepared for anything." Camille, his middle child, had cried in the doorway for exactly 4 minutes before excusing herself to take a call. Julian, the youngest, hadn't come to the hospital at all. He'd sent flowers. By the time Victor returned home to Hale Manor, the visits had thinned to almost nothing. Birthdays came with cards, not company. Holidays came with excuses. The house, once alive with the noise of family gatherings and business dinners, had become a mausoleum with excellent lighting. The staff rotated through in shifts, nurses who checked his vitals and left, housekeepers who dusted rooms no one used, a cook who prepared meals. Victor often didn't finish because there was no one to share them with. He had everything, and he had nothing. It was Rosa who changed that, though neither of them understood it yet. She'd been hired 8 months after the accident, recommended by the agency as reliable, discreet, hard-working. A widow in her early 30s, She'd lost her husband to a construction accident 2 years earlier and had been raising Mateo alone ever since, piecing together income from cleaning jobs during the day and whatever else she could find at night. "You understand the schedule," the estate manager, Mr. Whitfield, had said during her interview, glancing at her file. "6 days a week, early mornings, Mr. Hale requires quiet. He doesn't like surprises." "I understand," Rosa had said. What she hadn't mentioned, because she couldn't afford to lose the job before she'd even started, was that her childcare had fallen through the week before, and she had no one else to watch Mateo during the day. The first time she brought him to the estate, she tucked him into a corner of the laundry room with a colouring book and strict instructions not to move. "Stay right here, sweetheart," she whispered. "Quiet as a little mouse. Okay?" Mateo had nodded solemnly, 4 crayons clutched in his small fist. He did not stay quiet as a little mouse. Not for long. Victor first noticed the boy on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into Rosa's employment. He'd been sitting in his wheelchair by the window of the sunroom, staring out at a garden that hadn't been properly tended in months, when a small rubber ball rolled across the floor and bumped gently against his footrest. He looked down. A toddler stood a few feet away, hands over his mouth, eyes enormous with the specific terror only small children possess when they've done something they suspect is very wrong. "Whose child is this?" Victor said, his voice sharp enough that Mateo flinched. Rosa came rushing in seconds later, breathless, mortified. "Mr. Hale, I am so sorry. He got away from me. It won't happen again, I promise." "Get him out of here," Victor said, not looking at her, still staring at the boy. Rosa scooped Mateo up immediately, murmuring apologies, as she backed out of the room. Victor turned his wheelchair back toward the window, but before she disappeared through the doorway, he heard the boy whisper something to his mother. "Is the man in the chair, sad mama?" Rosa didn't answer, but Victor did, quietly, to no one but himself. "Yes," he said. "He is." For the next several days, Victor found himself listening for small footsteps. He told himself he didn't want to hear. He caught glimpses of Mateo in hallways, being hurried along by Rosa, who kept the boy on a tight leash after the sunroom incident, terrified of losing the only job that had kept a roof over their heads since her husband died. But Hale Manor was enormous, and a 3-year-old with sturdy legs and endless curiosity could not be contained forever. It was during the second week that Victor found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, waiting for something. Not a phone call from his children, not news from the board. He was waiting to see if the boy would wander in again. He did. "You're not supposed to be in here," Victor said, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. Mateo held up a small wooden block. "I builded a tower," he announced, as if this explained everything. "Did you?" Victor said. "It fall down, though." Mateo's face crumpled slightly with the memory of this tragedy. Victor felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar, something he hadn't felt in longer than he wanted to admit. He gestured, almost against his own will, toward the low table beside him. "Bring it here, show me. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, pushed aside, forgotten by the people who were supposed to show up for you, stay with this one. Because what happens next between this lonely old man and this fearless little boy is going to break you open before it puts you back together. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss where this goes." Rosa found them like that 20 minutes later, Mateo perched on the ottoman beside Victor's wheelchair, stacking wooden blocks with the intense concentration only a toddler could muster, while Victor watched with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Not the tight, closed-off mask he usually wore. Something softer, something almost startled by its own existence. "Mateo," she said carefully, hovering in the doorway, "we need to let Mr. Hale rest." "He's fine where he is," Victor said, without looking up. Rosa froze. In 8 months of working at Hale Manor, she had never once heard Victor Hale invite anyone to stay in a room with him. She'd heard the stories from the other staff, how he'd once had a nurse fired for humming while she worked, how he'd gone 3 days without speaking to anyone, after a physical therapist suggested he try to stay positive. "Sir, I don't want him to be a bother." "He's not a bother." Victor finally looked up at her, and for a moment, something passed between them that neither could name. Let him finish his tower. That night, after Rosa had put Mateo to bed in the small apartment they shared, above a laundromat 2 miles from the estate. She sat at their kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time, turning the day over in her mind like a coin she couldn't quite believe was real. She thought of her husband, David, and the way he used to say that kindness had a way of finding the people who needed it most, even in places you'd never expect. She hadn't believed him back then. She'd believed it even less after the accident that took him from her, after months of scraping by on savings that dwindled faster than she could replace them, after nights spent calculating exactly how many more days she could stretch a bag of rice. But something had shifted today. She didn't know what to make of it yet. She didn't know yet how much it would cost her. Over the following weeks, what started as an accident became a routine. Mateo would find his way to whatever room Victor occupied, and instead of being shooed away, he'd be allowed to stay. Sometimes they built towers. Sometimes Mateo simply narrated the adventures of his plastic dinosaur while Victor pretended to read his newspaper, secretly listening to every word. Sometimes, on the harder days, when Victor's body ached in ways the doctors couldn't explain, and his mood turned dark and brittle, Mateo would simply climb up beside him and rest his small head against the arm of the wheelchair, and somehow that was enough to pull Victor back from the edge of something he didn't like to think about. "You're good with him," Rosa said one afternoon, watching from the doorway as Victor helped Mateo sound out the letters in a picture book, his weathered finger tracing beneath each word. "I wasn't good with mine," Victor admitted, before he could stop himself. "My children, I was gone more than I was home. Business trips, board meetings, deals that couldn't wait." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I told myself I was building something for them, a legacy. I didn't realize until it was too late that what they actually wanted was just this." He gestured vaguely at the space between himself and Mateo. "Somebody to sit with them." Rosa didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Victor seemed grateful for the silence. It was around this time that Victor began asking Rosa questions too, small ones at first, about where she was from, how long she'd been widowed, whether Mateo had always been so fearless. Rosa answered carefully, guarded, unused to her employer taking any interest in her life beyond whether the silver had been polished correctly. "My husband, scaffolding collapsed, he was 31. "I'm sorry," Victor said, and it didn't sound like the automatic sympathy of a man saying what was expected. It sounded like he meant it. "Everyone says that." Rosa's voice had an edge to it she didn't try to soften. "But nobody stays long enough to actually help. They say sorry and then they go back to their lives, and I'm the one who has to figure out how to feed my son." Victor was quiet for a long moment. "My mother cleaned houses," he said, finally, "before I made anything of myself. Before the company, before any of this." He gestured at the vast room around them, the imported furniture, the oil paintings. She scrubbed floors on her knees in houses twice this size, and the families she worked for barely looked at her. "I used to wait for her outside sometimes, and I'd watch how they treated her, and I promised myself I would never let anyone I loved be treated that way." Rosa stared at him. "I didn't know that." "Nobody does. It's not the kind of thing that makes it into the magazine profiles." A dry, humorless laugh. "Self-made billionaire, that's the story they like. Nobody wants to hear about the mother who died with bad knees and a bad back, so her son could go to a school that would have her scrubbing its floors 10 years later." Something in Rosa's chest cracked open at that, not pity exactly, but recognition. A shared understanding between two people who had both learned, in different ways, what it meant to be invisible to the people who held all the power. It was 3 weeks after that conversation that the crisis happened, the one that would change everything. Rosa had stepped out to take an urgent call from the school about a mix-up with Mateo's paperwork, leaving him in the sunroom with his crayons, believing, as she always did, that she'd only be gone a few minutes. She hadn't accounted for the nurse being 40 minutes late. She hadn't accounted for Mr. Whitfield being off-site for a supplier meeting, or the housekeeper's dentist appointment running long, or any of the small, ordinary failures that stacked on top of each other that particular Tuesday until Victor Hale was alone in his study, his heart racing erratically, his vision swimming, and no one within earshot to help him, except a 3-year-old boy who had wandered in looking for his mother. The same scene that had opened this story now played out in full, Mateo's small hand slamming against the emergency button, the alarm tearing through the silent halls of Hale Manor, Rosa sprinting from the kitchen where she'd finally hung up the phone, her heart in her throat, before she even understood what was happening. She found Victor slumped but conscious, his chest heaving, sweat soaking through his shirt, and Mateo standing beside him, patting his arm with the fierce, uncomplicated determination only a child could summon. "It's okay, mister," Mateo was saying over and over. "It's okay, it's okay." The paramedics arrived 9 minutes later. Rosa rode in the ambulance, though no one had asked her to, though it wasn't remotely her place, gripping Victor's hand the entire way while Mateo sat wide-eyed in the seat beside her, clutching his plastic dinosaur like a talisman. At the hospital, doctors determined that Victor had suffered a severe cardiac event, compounded by a blood pressure crisis that left unaddressed even 10 more minutes, could have killed him. The emergency button, the one he'd stubbornly refused to rely on for months, had saved his life. But it wasn't the button that had saved him, it was the boy who had known, without being told, without fully understanding what was happening, that pressing it was the right thing to do. When Victor woke in the hospital bed the next morning, groggy and disoriented, the first face he saw wasn't a nurse's. It was Mateo's, peering over the bed rail with those enormous dark eyes, his small hand already reaching for Victor's. "You scared me, mister," Mateo whispered. Victor's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with his medical condition. "I scared myself too, little man," he said hoarsely. Behind Mateo, Rosa stood near the window, exhausted, her clothes rumpled from the sleepless night in a hospital chair, watching the two of them, with an expression caught somewhere between relief and fear, because she understood even then, even before anyone said a word about it, that something fundamental had shifted. And when the Hale children caught wind of what had happened, of exactly who had been in that room when their father nearly died, the fragile peace of the last several weeks would not survive it. If this story has you holding your breath already, drop a comment telling me what you'd have done in Mateo's place, and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Stay close, because what the Hale children do next is about to turn ugly fast. The news reached Bradley Hale before Victor had even been discharged from the hospital. He heard it secondhand from Mr. Whitfield, who called him in a state of controlled panic to explain that Victor had suffered a medical emergency, that he was stable now, that the situation had been handled, and that the housekeeper's son had been the one to raise the alarm. "The housekeeper's son," Bradley repeated slowly, sitting in his corner office, 40 floors above the city, his reflection ghosted faintly in the window glass. "You're telling me a toddler saved my father's life, and my father is now what exactly? Bonding with the woman who cleans his floors?" "I wouldn't characterize it that way, sir," Whitfield said carefully. "Then how would you characterize it?" Whitfield didn't have an answer that would satisfy him, so Bradley hung up and immediately called his sister. Camille answered on the second ring, already halfway through a glass of wine, judging by the slight slur creeping into her consonants. "Bradley, if this is about the quarterly numbers again, Dad's in the hospital." The line went silent for a beat too long. "What happened?" "Heart thing. He's stable. That's not the part you need to worry about." Bradley's jaw tightened as he stared out at the skyline. "The maid's kid is the one who called it in, and apparently Dad's been letting the kid run around the house for weeks, playing with him, talking to the mother like they're old friends." So, Camille, think about what that means. Think about what happens if Dad decides he wants to, I don't know, thank them, reward them. You know how sentimental people get after something like this." There was a longer silence this time, and when Camille spoke again, her voice had lost its wine-softened edges. "You think she's after something?" "I think," Bradley said, "that a widow with no money and a father who's isolated, guilty and sitting on $4 billion is a combination we cannot afford to ignore." Julian, when they finally reached him 3 hours later, he'd been unreachable, as usual, off on some retreat with his phone deliberately switched off, didn't share his siblings' urgency at first. "He almost died," Julian said, his voice tight over the speakerphone during the emergency call the three of them arranged that evening. "And your first thought is about the will?" "My first thought," Bradley snapped, "is that none of us were there. We haven't been there in months. And now some stranger and her kid have wedged themselves into his life while we were all busy living ours. That should scare you too, Julian, whether you want to admit it or not." Julian didn't respond right away. Whatever guilt lived beneath his casual detachment, it was enough to keep him quiet. By the time Victor returned home from the hospital 5 days later, all three of his children had descended on Hale Manor for the first time in over a year, not out of concern for their father's recovery, though they dressed the visit in those terms, but to assess firsthand exactly how much ground Rosa had gained in their absence. The reunion was cold from the start. "Dad, you look tired," Camille said, air kissing his cheek in the entryway while her eyes swept the room, cataloguing. "I nearly died, Camille. Tired is an improvement." Bradley didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the staff situation." "There is no staff situation," Victor said, wheeling himself past them toward the sunroom, where he hoped, Mateo might still be waiting with his blocks. "There's a woman who does her job well and her son, who happened to save my life while the three of you were unreachable." "That's not fair," Julian started. "It's entirely fair," Victor said, not slowing his chair. "I called each of you. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. A 3-year-old was more present in this house." Over the next 2 weeks, the siblings regrouped, this time with more strategy and less raw emotion. Bradley, always the tactician, was the one who suggested watching Rosa closely, documenting her interactions with Victor, building a case, in case a case was ever needed. "We're not doing anything wrong," Camille said, though her voice wavered slightly. "We're protecting Dad. From himself if we have to." It was Bradley who noticed, during one of his increasingly frequent visits, that a set of antique cufflinks, a gift from Victor's late wife kept in a locked drawer in his study, had gone missing. It was Bradley who suggested quietly to Whitfield that perhaps someone with access to that room ought to be asked some questions. Rosa was called into Whitfield's office on a Thursday morning, her hands still faintly damp from washing dishes, her heart sinking the moment she saw Bradley Hale seated in the corner, arms crossed, watching her like she was already guilty. "Mrs. Reeves," Whitfield began, unable to meet her eyes, "some items have gone missing from Mr. Hale's study. Given your increased access to that room recently, we need to ask you some questions." "I haven't taken anything," Rosa said immediately, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I would never—" "No one's accusing you of anything yet," Bradley said smoothly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We just find it curious. You've become quite close to my father in a short amount of time. Your son has the run of the house, and now valuable items are disappearing." "I don't know anything about cufflinks," Rosa said, her voice cracking slightly despite her best efforts to keep it level. "I clean, I take care of Mateo. That's all I've ever done in this house." "That's all you've ever done?" Bradley repeated, letting the words hang in the air where the accusation reached Victor by that evening, delivered not by Whitfield, who was too uncomfortable to face him, but by Camille, who framed it as concern rather than confrontation. "We just think it's worth looking into, Dad, that's all. For your own protection." Victor's hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. "Rosa didn't take anything." "How do you know that?" "Because I know her," Victor said, his voice rising in a way none of his children had heard in years. "Because in 8 months, she has never once asked me for anything. Not a raise, not a favor, not so much as a kind word, and yet you three, who stand to inherit everything I've built, have spent the last 2 weeks trying to prove she's a thief." Camille flinched, but didn't back down. "We're trying to protect this family." "You are this family," Victor said quietly, and something in his voice made even Camille go still. "And in 6 months you visited me 4 times combined. Rosa's son pressed a button that saved my life, while you were all unreachable. So forgive me if I find your sudden concern for my welfare a little late, and a little convenient." That night, Rosa sat in her small apartment, Mateo already asleep in the next room, and finally let herself cry, quietly, so he wouldn't hear, so he wouldn't know how frightened his mother was. She thought about quitting. She thought about how much easier it would be to simply disappear from the Hale family's orbit before things got worse, before the accusations became something more permanent, something that could follow her, damage her chances of ever finding work again. But she also thought about Victor's face in that hospital bed, the way he'd looked at Mateo like the boy had handed him something he hadn't known he was missing. She thought about her husband's voice, telling her that kindness had a way of finding people who needed it, and she wondered for the first time if maybe she was supposed to be the kindness Victor Hale had been missing his whole life, and maybe that was worth fighting for even now. She decided she would not quit. Not yet. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, not even Victor's own children, was that Victor had spent the last 3 years quietly documenting exactly what kind of people his children had become. Financial records, private investigator reports, recorded conversations he'd never intended anyone to hear, kept locked away for a day he'd hoped would never come. That day was arriving faster than any of them realized. 2 days later, Whitfield discovered the missing cufflinks exactly where Victor had left them himself, tucked inside a different drawer during a moment of confusion after his hospital stay. Proof, immediate and undeniable, that Rosa had never touched them at all. But by then, the damage to her name had already spread through the house like smoke. And Victor, watching his children scramble to explain away their accusations, finally decided enough was enough. "Gather everyone in the drawing room tomorrow evening," he told Whitfield, his voice cold and steady in a way that hadn't been heard in this house in years. "All 3 of my children. Rosa too. It's time they understood exactly who they've been dealing with." If you've made it this far, you already know this story is far from over. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what Victor reveals next, because it's about to change everything for everyone in that room. The drawing room at Hale Manor had not been used for a formal gathering in over 3 years, not since Victor's wife's memorial service, when the family had last stood together in the same space without arguing about money. Now, as evening settled over the estate, the room filled again, this time with a different kind of tension humming beneath the surface. Bradley arrived first, sharp-suited and rehearsing his defense in his head. Camille came next, clutching a glass of wine she hadn't touched, her makeup unable to fully hide the exhaustion of the last 2 weeks. Julian slipped in last, hovering near the door like a man who wanted an exit route. Rosa arrived hesitantly, Mateo's small hand gripped tightly in hers, uncertain why she'd been summoned alongside the family that had spent the past 2 weeks trying to destroy her reputation. Whitfield stood near the fireplace, a folder clutched against his chest, his expression unreadable. Victor wheeled himself to the center of the room and let the silence stretch long enough to make everyone uncomfortable before he spoke. 3 years ago, he began, after your mother died, I hired a private investigator, not to spy on strangers, to understand my own children. He nodded toward Whitfield, who stepped forward and handed him the folder. I wanted to know who you really were, underneath the visits and the phone calls and the birthday cards. I wanted to know if I'd raised people worth being proud of. "Dad, this is insane," Bradley said, his voice tight. "You hired someone to spy on us? I hired someone to show me the truth, because none of you were willing to." Victor opened the folder, though he didn't need to read from it. He'd memorized every line months ago. "Bradley, 2 years ago, you told the board I was nearly finished as CEO before my accident had even happened, while pursuing a vote to force my early retirement. Camille, you've told at least 4 different Friends that you're just waiting for your inheritance to finally leave your marriage, a marriage you've complained about for years but refused to end until the money arrives. Julian," Victor's eyes settled on his youngest, "you haven't held a stable job in 6 years, living entirely off funds I quietly wired to you every month while telling people you're finding yourself." The room had gone deathly silent. Camille's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. "I know all of it," Victor continued, his voice steady despite the years of hurt beneath it. "I've known for a long time. And still, when I nearly died in this house alone, I called each of you, not one of you answered." "Dad, that's not fair, we didn't know," Julian started. "You didn't know because you weren't paying attention," Victor snapped, the first real crack of anger breaking through. "None of you have been paying attention to me in years. You've been paying attention to the balance sheet, to the timeline, to when exactly this would all become yours." He turned then, his eyes finding Rosa, who stood frozen near the doorway. Mateo pressed against her leg, sensing the tension without understanding it. "This woman," Victor said, "has been in my employment for 8 months. In that time, she has never once asked me for anything beyond her wages. She didn't know who I was when her son wandered into my study. She didn't calculate an angle. She simply raised a boy kind enough, brave enough to press a button that saved my life while my own children were unreachable. His voice softened, just slightly, and you three repaid that by accusing her of theft. The cufflinks were missing, Bradley said weakly. The cufflinks were in a different drawer, because I moved them myself, disoriented, 3 days after my heart nearly gave out, a fact Whitfield confirmed 2 days ago, which none of you bothered to ask me about before deciding Rosa was a thief. Bradley had no response for that. Camille's eyes had dropped to the floor. Julian looked, for the first time in the conversation, genuinely ashamed. I'm not doing this to punish you, Victor said, quieter now, though the weight of his words filled the room regardless. I'm doing this because I need you to understand something. I built an empire out of nothing because my mother scrubbed floors so I could have a chance she never had. And somewhere along the way, in chasing that empire, I forgot to teach my own children the one thing she taught me, that money means nothing if it costs you the people who actually show up for you. He reached for Rosa's hand then, and though she hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate, she let him take it. Rosa didn't marry into this family, she doesn't have my name, but in 8 months, she and her son have shown me more genuine care than the 3 of you have shown me in the last 3 years combined. That is not nothing. I will not pretend it's nothing. So what? Camille said, her voice brittle. You're cutting us out? For a maid and her kid? I am restructuring my estate, Victor said calmly, to reflect the truth of who has actually been present in my life. You will not be cut out entirely, you're still my children, and I still love you despite everything. But you will no longer receive unconditional inheritances the moment I die. You will each need to prove, through actual involvement in this family and in the company, that you deserve what you've been assuming was owed to you. He paused, and a trust will be established for Mateo's education and future, along with fair, permanent compensation for Rosa, regardless of what happens to me. Rosa's breath caught. Mr. Hale, I never asked for— I know, Victor said, looking at her with something that had softened entirely now, all traces of the cold, bitter man from 6 months ago gone from his face. That's exactly why you're getting it. The room sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Bradley's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, but even he seemed to understand there was no version of this fight he could win. Camille set her wineglass down with a trembling hand. Julian simply stared at the floor, the weight of years of quiet finally settling on his shoulders. It was Mateo, oblivious to the gravity of the adult conversation happening above his head, who broke the silence, tugging on Victor's sleeve. Mister, he said, holding up his plastic dinosaur, does this mean you're not sad anymore? Victor looked down at the boy, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he smiled, really smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. No, little man, he said, his voice thick. I don't think I am. In the weeks that followed, the mansion that had felt like a mausoleum slowly began to feel like a home again. Not because of grand gestures or expensive renovations, but because of small things. A toddler's laughter echoing down previously silent hallways. Rosa's quiet presence no longer confined to the shadows of her job title. Victor wheeling himself into rooms he used to avoid simply because someone might be there waiting for him. Bradley, Camille, and Julian didn't disappear from his life. Slowly, awkwardly, they began the harder work of actually showing up, not out of obligation, but because watching their father come alive again forced each of them to confront exactly how much they'd let slip away. It wasn't fixed overnight. Some wounds don't heal that fast. But for the first time in years, there was an honest effort being made, instead of a performance for an inheritance. Rosa never stopped being Mateo's mother first, and Victor's employee second. That never changed, not really. But something else grew alongside it, something neither of them had expected or gone looking for. A quiet, unshakable family, built not out of blood or obligation, but out of showing up when it mattered most. Victor Hale, the man once known only for the empire he built, was slowly becoming known, at least within the walls of his own home, as something else entirely. A man who'd been given a second chance by a boy too young to understand what he'd done, and wise enough not to hesitate, because in the end, it was never about the billions in the bank or the company that bore his name, or the inheritance his children had spent years circling like vultures. It was about who was willing to sit beside you when the room went dark and the monitor screamed and no one else was coming. Sometimes it isn't blood that saves you. Sometimes it's the people the world overlooks, a tired mother, a fearless little boy, who show up exactly when it matters most. If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments who you think deserves love more, the family you're born into, or the ones who actually show up for you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next story.